Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Helen Deutsch, Director of the Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies at UCLA and the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library. I am also Professor of English, and I am really delighted and excited to welcome you all to this special event, Blackness, Immobility, and Visibility in Europe, 1600 to 1800, a new collaborative scholarly resource at Journal 18, which is being presented today by Professor Zirwat Chowdhury of Art History and Louis Susunaga, class of 2021, UCLA, who assisted Zirwat on this project. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the origins of the project, not to take away from anything that these two people are going to tell you, but responding in June 2020 to the rallying cries of Black Lives Matter amid conditions of a nearly universal lockdown from a global pandemic, Journal 18 invited its readers to contribute to a digital timeline chronicling the representation and regulation of Black bodies in Europe from circa 1600 to 1800. The aim of the project was to create a digital resource that could illuminate, through the spatial proximities of a timeline, Blackness as lived experience, representational conventions, and colonial category, tracing across its differentials the racialization of the purportedly universal freedom to cast breath, stretch one's legs, move of one's own will. And that will give you a great example of Zirwat's wonderful prose. She wrote a fantastic introduction to this timeline. I cannot recommend it to you highly enough. And the result is a really creative and useful resource that the center was really honored to support. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. Zirwat Chowdhury is Assistant Professor of 18th and 19th Century European Art in the Department of Art History at UCLA, and she was actually an Albus Getty Fellow at the Clark some years ago, where I first met her. She also serves as Notes and Queries Editor at Journal 18, which is an online open access peer-reviewed journal devoted to the art and culture of the long 18th century from around the globe. And she is going to be joined today by Louis Susunaga, class of 2021, who is double majoring in art history and political science at UCLA. And Louis, as I said, served as the RA on this project, which was also supported by the UCLA Dean of Humanities Discretionary Fund. Zirwat's research and teaching explore the interconnected histories and historiographies of art and visual culture in Britain, France, and South Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries. And her current book project, Enlightened Relations, Art Without Common Sense in late 18th and early 19th century Britain and colonial South Asia, traces within the intertwined networks of British and South Asian art and visual culture an alternative history to the late Enlightenment conceptualization of sympathy. So we're going to turn this over now to our two speakers, and I'm going to ask you when we get to the Q&A to submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And the wonderful Jeanette Levere is going to be moderating the Q&A, and I will leap in to arbitrate if need be. Okay, so that's enough from me, and Zirwat and Louis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for this very kind introduction, and most importantly to the Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies for this important support of our project. We really could not have done it this summer without the center and the dean's support for this project. So before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge, as a member of the Department of Art History, our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. I realize we're virtual right now, but I think we are still mostly landed in LA at the moment. So Helen very nicely introduced the framework of the project a little bit, and Louis and I will tell you a little bit more about it today, especially the pros and cons of doing a digital project in 2020 amid lockdown. So as Helen mentioned, the timeline was an effort to chronicle the representation and regulation of Black bodies in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. And as Helen also mentioned, I have a brief introduction that accompanies the project if you want to learn more about some of its conceptual parameters and ambitions. the important thing to really note is that this is a project that I think is very much of its moment, and I hope that is what will also give it a longevity into the future rather than date it very quickly. And it really came out of course, a moment where we had a confluence of living under lockdown and also facing, I think, particularly resurgent cries for racial justice. And this, I think, particularly resonated, resonated with my fellow editors of the journal, at Journal 18 and myself. And the germ for this project came out of a course actually that I taught at UCLA last year in fall 2019, and that in which Louis was enrolled. And this is an upper level undergraduate survey course on 18th century European art. And as I taught that class, I thought one of the sort of responsibilities on my plate already in fall 2019 was to find a way to teach European art that could be less Eurocentric in its framing. And that, of course, brought with it a challenge, the responsibility rather than challenge of trying to find a way to to demystify Black presence in Europe in the 18th century without erasing the histories of violence on these bodies and personhoods as well. So for that, and I'm going to share a screen with you so that you can see, I figured this would be easier than leading you through the website itself. So this is the homepage of the timeline itself. I encourage all of you to, go to Journal 18's website and explore the timeline. We were very pleased to have, contributions from I think roughly like 40 contributors internationally. And there are almost 230 entries, I think. And this is just, what made it into the timeline itself. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that selection process. So this is a working timeline that I put together in that class that I mentioned. And this was a way to give students some reference and context for what were various laws and policies and events that took place or were implemented or enacted across the 18th century pertaining to the lives of Black people, and just so that they could have, engage with these works of art in relation to some of these key events. And so in June, in the midst of this lockdown and, amidst these calls for Black Lives Matter, my editors and I decided that, it seemed timely to do a crowdsourced project, both as a way to, really create community with our readers. So not just, feed them more knowledge and information, but also to invite their participation into creating a work that we could build together. And also, one of our objectives in doing a crowdsourced project was that we realized, we're not the first people to initiate this, we're hardly initiating this conversation. There's certainly been, really rich and important scholarship that is ongoing even in the discipline of art history, that is, thinking about histories of race and racialization. And this was, to crowdsource this project was both to recognize the limits of how much we could do on our own, but also to be able to draw on existing resources, but in a way that could respond to the exigencies of our present moment as well. So we put out, a call for participation that we circulated, as much as we could through social media, various listservs, academic listservs. And, we really tried our best to open up this project to audiences that were both, affiliated with academic institutions or even beyond. And, we were thrilled that the final list of participants had, several independent scholars as well. And so, as we mentioned, part of our framing was to put, to find some ways through which to talk about how the movement of Black bodies was regulated in Europe, as well as in sites of empire, and how Blackness became a legible visual category through such measures in the 17th and 18th centuries. And what we hope this timeline would do, and again, I invite all of you to explore it and to see if, these are discoveries you can make as you navigate the timeline, was to put, to present to our audiences and our readers in some ways, Blackness both as lived experience and as a colonial category, not to mention a visual convention. So not to kind of, parse out one without the other, to try and find intersections across the three as well, while acknowledging that, of course, at the same time that there's this question of immobility, there's also very much the fact that the displacement of Black bodies across the globe was at the heart of, this particular racialization and formulation of Blackness. So what I have here on the screen are some, guiding instructions that we provided for our participants. We decided one of the best ways to gather this input was, to share a public, to share an open Google document. We provided my contact information so that people could contact me if they had any questions about, how exactly they should proceed to share, whatever they wanted to add to the Google document. And of course, this meant that from the get-go, we had to establish some, not finalized concrete conventions, but just, how exactly were people even going to add to this timeline? So this is just, a little screenshot of the Google document that we shared with our audience, with our contributors. And what you see highlighted in blue, you can see like people, so we set the dates, the chronology at 1600 to 1800. We were thrilled that there was enthusiastic input beyond the scope of our timeline itself. We provided some sample entries just so that people could see what kind of information we were maybe looking for, but certainly that, leaving room for other contributions as well. And it was actually great to get emails from a lot of contributors, even asking, for example, it was interesting, just hearing the range of questions from like, can we include Russian examples? Are there limitations of what medium of art, or does it have to, count as an artwork? So it was, in some ways very conventional art history questions, but it was also a good way to establish some parameters for what was going to go into this timeline itself. And as I mentioned, even in thinking about conventions, of course, you can't do a project that is about the representation of Blackness without immediately, stepping quite deeply into ongoing debates in art history about the titling of works of art. So one step, for example, that museums have been recently taking is to name, where possible, sitters in works of art, especially portraits, who have maybe previously been unnamed or even not named in the title of an artwork. And so we acknowledged that where we could, but we added to that a convention of, especially for portraits, of so-and-so with now unnamed attendant. And I talk about this a little bit in my introduction, where I talk about why we chose this word attendant rather than say page or servant. And part of that was in in drawing on the etymology of the word attendant, and so that we could highlight these figures not just as subordinate figures, but rather those who are kind of lurking and waiting on the sidelines. So attendant has its etymology in this act of waiting, and the waiting not just upon the people they're serving, but upon their own moment of fugitive freedom as well. So we were really pleased that most of our contributors were really on board with that, and I think that's something that allows us to see some of these artworks in different ways as well. So this then led to where Louis will tell you more. So once we got all this information on Google Doc, and keep in mind, this was really not for very long, between the end of June to the beginning of August. So we were thrilled, just with the volume of, contributions that we received. The next task at hand was to transfer that information into the template for the timeline itself, which is an open source platform that has been designed by Night Lab at Northwestern University. Full disclosure, that is where I did my PhD, but I did not have any particular connection with the people who developed this web-based program, the timeline program itself. But Louis can tell you a little bit more, since he did all the hard work of getting this information into the spreadsheet that you see here.
Thank you. Yeah, so once I had the information gathered in the Google Doc, what I did is I basically had to put it on a certain format that it was guidelined to me. And so basically, everything has to be with such detail, because if you mess up even like a comma where it's not supposed to go, it will completely mess up the format on the actual website. So, and that's what HTML format is. So yeah, for instance, those long links that you see under media credit, those are the HTML format text that I have to like go in and make sure that everything is completely correct, and put the titles that are supposed to go in and everything. Because yeah, like we did run out of even though like a lot of it the guidelines were pretty straightforward, there was a lot of things that didn't go as smoothly as we would have liked to. For instance, at some point, some of us, the whole timeline when it started messed up just because I didn't. There was like some error within one of the media credit links on the Google Sheets. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but at the same time, like I feel like, at least for me, it was definitely worth it, and something that I learned a lot about on this particular project.
Yeah, so as Louis was saying, we had to make, some decisions about what was going to go into the timeline itself. And, because the timeline is also so much based on, being able to actually share an image of the object itself, where we could not find, an open source, an image to an open source, a link to an open source image of the object, we had to make the decision of not including that particular object in the timeline. So for example, here on the left, you see, for 17, the entries that we received for say 1716 through 1718. 1717, that entry did not make it to the timeline just because we were unable to find a working image for it. So, there were just some of these decisions going back and forth, and even, there was definitely a learning curve to it. Like Louis mentioned, even the template had its own logic, and this, I think, raised for us some really important questions about how there are really great technologies maybe out there, but making those technologies adaptable to their humanistic uses is another kind of conversation and dialogue. So I would be, as we think about the future of this timeline, I've already received some really great feedback from people who've been using the timeline, just about, how we can maybe make some modifications, which are certainly not within our power because they're right now very much limited to how the template itself works. But it would be interesting to be able to see if we could work with Night Lab in the future to make some of those modifications. So right down to, for example, one of the, I think, very fair criticisms we received was that it wasn't as clear that, there was a link that one could click on at the bottom that would take you to the museum collection, or that just most importantly, that the images were often very small. And this was very strange because we really just had no control over the size of the image itself. It just, sometimes the text would be larger, sometimes the image would be smaller. So it would be nice to be able to arrive at maybe more of like an art historical template for a project like this. But, this was certainly a very good place to start. Another thing that I want to add is that, as we've put this resource, out into the world, I think I've often had people ask, what do you want people to do with this timeline? And honestly, what we're hoping is that this can be an open, an accessible resource that can be put to different ends. And we're really trying not to put too many, sort of prescriptions on how that should be done. I've been really encouraged by feedback from colleagues who are both in museums and in academic, institutions, who are saying that, this is one way just to even have this information handy. And we provide references, for example, at the bottom right for 1718, you'll see that there's a reference to a book by a historian called Jennifer Palmer, whose work was actually quite important to the class I was teaching, and then to the thinking of this timeline itself. But that, we're providing references where we can, but there was really, because it's a crowdsourced project, it will be a bit uneven across the timeline. Like there were some entries that had more information than others. Louis got to do quite a bit of research, on secondary sources, just digging up some of these colonial policies based on the secondary literature that's out there. But certainly, there's always going to be room to do more and add more. But, this was just a way to put something out there, as people are, I think, finding new pressures to have these conversations in their classrooms as well. So I think Louis wanted to talk a little bit about one particular image.
Yeah, so I think overall I learned a lot about particularly my favorite era of art is the 17th and 18th century. So I was really excited to work on this project, and especially because it's very much Eurocentrist in a lot of ways. Up until I took her class, like all we talked about, it was pretty Eurocentric. So it was really refreshing to learn about, you know, people of color and Black people being represented in this period of time. And so one of the things that I found pretty striking was how widely they are portrayed and how differently they're portrayed. And for instance, so this particular painting, which was one of the works of art that I particularly found interesting, is by Diego Velázquez, and the subject is Juan de Pareja, and this was his basically a slave. So this painting was made in one of Velázquez trips to Italy, and so people were not completely sure why. Scholars don't know why he made the painting, if whether it was for his to elevate him or just as a practice because he had a commission by the Pope to paint the Pope. So that is not clear yet. But what's interesting is how, even though as a slave, he's very much portrayed and represented as someone with dignity and pride, and how detailed everything is about to the smallest thing, just like such as his gaze. And if like some art historians talk about how if you really look deep enough, you can see even some sort of melancholy and sadness in his gaze, even with that pride. And so it's just it was something that represented a slave in this manner, just like a noble or a royal at that time. It was such a thing that hadn't been done before. So I found it like pretty, especially the irony, because since Diego Velázquez was the basically his slaver, yet he was painting him in this manner is kind of ironic in a lot of ways. So so yeah, it was just one of those paintings that really struck with me.
Thank you, Louise. And so just to add to, one of the things when you look at the timeline, thanks to Louise's effort and work in translating that information, is that in addition to the portrait of de Pareja, you also have a link to the date of his manumission from his enslaved status, and a link to the document for that manumission document as well, or for a link to the manumission document itself. So we've tried as much as we can, I mean, there wasn't any intentional like, oh, we have this portrait, therefore we must add that. I think we were just glad, lucky that our contributors made those judgment calls themselves. But what we're really hoping is, in a way, this project is very 18th century in its ambition, right? In the introduction, I mentioned a little bit how I, as an 18th centuryist, was thinking very much about the kind of logic of the encyclopédie, the 18th century, encyclopedic project. And how, rather than seeing this just as a linear chronology, that maybe people will move back and forth across the timeline and notice and make, their own connections across different works and events as well. So that's, really just a very brief overview, but what we'd love is, to take questions from you and hear your thoughts and, offer any clarifications we can about the timeline itself.
While we wait for questions to come in, I wanted to maybe start with the question, and I wanted to thank you both. That was a wonderful presentation and really rich, and it's given us a lot to think about. And I thought that analogy to the encyclopedia was really great, and that informs my question, because I'm very moved by how this was inspired by the moment that we're in. And by the constraints that we're under, right, which are extreme, but they're in other ways, these constraints that we're under, people are beginning to discover new possibilities because of them. Like, we can have this Zoom event and people can attend from all over the world. right? And so there are constraints and there are possibilities and there are new ways of thinking about what we do. And I was really struck too by the communal nature of what you're doing. And the way that you two are collaborators, and then you're collaborating with your entire community. And our model of scholarship in the past has really been so individualistic and proprietary. And I see a resonance between the politics that inspired the project of community and social justice and this new kind of non-hierarchical communal idea of what it means to discover things and to publish things. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about this project as a kind of a way into thinking about the future of what scholarship is and does.
Yeah, I think one thing to note, and thank you for that, Helen, for that attentiveness to this project too, that in a way, scholarship has always been collaborative. How often does any of us write anything without talking to a friend, an interlocutor, or someone? So, we have our own erasures of where we put our authorship to a project versus all the conversations that go into it. And I think, if anything, this was really a way to be able to just kind of pull the curtain back from how we do a lot of our scholarship. And rather than worrying about this is going to be the argument of this timeline, this timeline, I mean, I'm sure it has its own ideology in politics, but it doesn't have an argument per se, right? What we hope is to open it up for people, like I said, to be able to move through it and maybe start to put together certain narratives or trajectories or possibilities. And that's certainly something to keep in mind for the future. I think there were one form of feedback that I often got was, oh, I wish there was, maybe a little essay or an entry accompanying each work. And it's tempting, as an art historian, I would love to, be like, let me give you my lecture on this work and that work. And Louis just did such a beautiful talk, even, just a beautiful job talking about the Velázquez. But I think, we want this to not be, come think about Blackness through this, and more, here is a resource if you want to do more with it. So, even when we provide some of the references, they're really starting points so that somebody doesn't have to start from scratch. But hopefully also that through that starting point, they're being directed towards possible lines of community as well. So yeah, I think if anything, it just means that I feel very proud of this project, but I also love that I don't have to be an author of it at all. Louis, did you have any thoughts, especially, coming into a project like this, versus like reading articles and essays and classes?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely like exciting to learn a lot about this. Like I said, because I hadn't seen that many works of art representing these bodies, so it was definitely really enlightening in a way, and also to some extent also quite shocking to see some images that represented more harshful things like rape. And so that's definitely something that was a little challenging in its own way, because it's something that it's not a lot of people know.
Yeah, I'm actually glad. I mean, not glad, but like I appreciate Louise bringing this up, because that was actually another conversation we had to have. Is we have one particular image that was quite graphic in its portrayal of sexual violence, and we had to talk about what kind of content warning, or especially if the logic of the timeline is the picture must be present. Could we, so there's one particular image, and for which we just had to put up a blank image, actually, a blackened image, and then have the link to the image be made available separately. And we had to quite, tweak the formatting of the template to be even able to do that. So I think, within that, of course, one of the things that rightly haunts this timeline too is where this desire to find the nobility of Black portrayal, it always goes hand in hand with also the spectacularization of the violence on it as well. Mm-hmm. And we, we had to be cautious about not just kind of feeding into that circulation of imagery.
Thank you both. I see that questions are coming in, so I'm going to let Jeanette read them.
Zirwat and Louis, we have a question from Mary Copeland who asks, by calling a slave or servant an attendant, while this does provide an understanding of their role, does it also serve to right gray the boundaries of the history of Blackness and servitude slavery? In other words, if an individual was a slave, is calling them an attendant unhistorical?
Thank you so much for that question. And it is that, how you're thinking about it is exactly something we had to deliberate about as well, is how do we remain any kind of fidelity to historicity while not necessarily in the name of historicity repeat certain forms of erasure and violence as well. And I think, so for example, often even just the category was somebody, an enslaved, companion or a page, like that's actually quite murky. So that word or those words have often been fillers. Like these are not often the original titles of these works. One of the things that we studied in that class was just even that what is often assumed maybe some kind of an attendant figure, like that there are important histories of interracial families that are existing in Europe as well, including through various patterns of subordination. So, attendant was our effort to, yes, respond to the ethical challenges of working on these images while keeping in play that, yes, they are attending upon, right? They're still like to keep in play that work of subordination without assuming that these figures were subordinated. So to leave some room for their search for their own liberation and freedom as well, which is of course something that is also historical because, if the paintings show these very sort of, docile attendants, what we actually see in the historical record is the number of times people ran away, they set fire to homes, burned down plantations. So it was actually a kind of responsibility to keep those different histories in play together.
Our next question comes from Saloni Mother. She says, thank you. The timeline is an exciting contribution. Congratulations. She wants to know about something that was no doubt at the heart of your project. How do you define Black?
Oof. Oh, goodness. I don't know if we still have arrived, right, at a very clear definition of this is, there's almost a kind of productive slippage between Black and Blackness. Like ness suggests permutations and modifications. Just it suggests a range of possibilities in a way that even Black seems just like you are this. So I think one of the things that that comes up in the timeline is even just a pattern for misidentification that has often happened, which is that figures that are portrayed as Black, perhaps, are automatically identified with some kind of Afro-Caribbean identity or geographical origin, whereas in fact the historical record across the 18th century makes it a much more fluid term, right? So one of the things that we mention, or I mentioned the intro, and that comes up in the timeline itself, is that that expression is deployed to refer to South Asians as well, and I think much more expansively even beyond that. Certainly, as much as I want to say with it, like that Black, certainly increasing from the late 17th century, takes on a certain kind of racialized association, right down, coming out of even an understanding of the races of man, like in a biblical sense. But I think it, as much as it brings to surface a certain notion of, again, inferiority or superiority for its foil, equally, we have examples in the timeline of just this continuing obsession with also the beauty of Black skin across the 17th and 18th centuries. And we highlight in this way the work of a scholar called Stephanie Camp, who passed away very, and her untimely death was actually a big loss for the field of African American studies. And she looks a lot at early modern travelogues and how Black features within that, certainly associated with some kind of African personhood, but also taking on not necessarily just these negative values. So I wish I could give you a very clear answer, Saloni, about what constitutes Black, but in a way, what started off with maybe do these images have Black sitters, and this is certainly an important sort of reflection in the painterly discourse itself, where right down to putting a figure in the corner is to play with shadow itself. At the same time, again, the historical record is very much about people who are not necessarily either, especially when you look at interracial relations.
Our next question comes from Merrick Robinson, who is an undergraduate research assistant at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He says his research and the research of his supervising professor focuses in part on the marking of skin in early modern era. From your experience in this project, were Black bodies smooth or demarked when presented in early modern art?
Thank you for that, and so exciting that you're also working as a research assistant on a similar project. I think we didn't necessarily. I don't recall, and Louis, please just correct me or jump in if you recall correctly. This is 2 weeks ago I had a better sort of recall of the full timeline that I even do right now, but. Certainly, as you're saying, smooth becomes, and I don't think it's quite necessarily in the way you're talking about marking, but smooth certainly in terms of polish, right? And what we know about what happens to enslaved bodies before they're put on the auction block, with the kind of oiling of skin and the hyper polish that is applied to make these bodies that have been subject to just unimaginable terrors, right, across the Middle Passage as well. So the function of polish to temporarily, put a sort of veneer of, to create a veneer that would allow the abuses of, what brought that body to the auction block in the first place to be momentarily erased, maybe. I think that's certainly something you notice in early modern art. I think just even in the ways in which, and especially, the medium of oil speaks to this well, and in portraiture. And I'm realizing as I answer your question that often glazes are used in portraits of white skin just to kind of add a luminosity to whiteness. At least that's how it's talked about. But as I answer your question, I'm realizing that there's a way in which that functions even in portrayals of Black skin as well. And I think we have, for example, a portrait of a man, of an unnamed sitter, possibly a man called William Barber, who was, the enslaved attendant, subsequently liberated of Dr. Johnson, by Joshua Reynolds, and it's an unfinished painting, and you can see a little bit more of the process through which Black skin is made up in 18th century painting in particular. So I think there's definitely a function of that. It'd be interesting to think about it in terms of the materiality of glazes as well. So thank you for that.
Our next question comes from Chase Smith, who thanks you for the presentation. And he says he's curious to follow up on Professor Deutsch's question about crowdsourcing and joint authorship. They would like to know, what are some of the challenges as well as opportunities for bringing together so many different contributors? For example, what types of strategies did you adopt to deal with different types of interpretations or emphases within the same project?
Thank you. And thank you really to all of you for these generous questions and thoughtful questions. I'm trying, I think in a way, one of the most productive decisions we took at the beginning of this project was to keep the interpretation at a minimum. So we weren't going to do a project that was going to be the equivalent of an entry with a wall label equivalent. So we weren't going to provide a lot of didactic information on these images necessarily. Like I said, at the most, we might provide 1 or 2 references. And I think that helped because that way people could add, an event or the name of or an artwork to the timeline without our necessarily having to immediately ask where beyond the immediacy of the date of its making or circulation or whatever pertinent date, whatever was the most pertinent date for it, usually was the date of its making. We didn't have to do more than that. So I think that certainly made things easier. Like I said, I think there were just really some questions initially. I mean, this always, like, you know, if the project was going to be Blackness, Immobility, and Visibility in Europe, you know, there was always immediately, of course, the question of why 1600 to 1800. And, you know, I talk about that a little bit in the timeline. Just I think there's a kind of intensity to form the intersection of global contact and violence and the displacement of bodies across the globe that was important to these dates as well. But I think, you know, it immediately raised questions of, well, is it just Europe? Is it are we talking about the European continent? Are we looking out into European colonies, places that, you know, we might teach today as European colonies, but that certainly were not, you know, the European colonies if you ask many others. So I think this is something that, you know, for example, we have some entries pertaining to Australia in the towards the tail end of the timeline. And this, of course, raises questions of, you know, whether they're erasures of indigenous homelands by making, you know, claims of this is because this is, you know, a colonial outpost of the British Empire, which it really quite isn't yet. So I think those, those were maybe some of the questions we had to deal with in terms of where is Europe and how much do we want to limit it to something called continental Europe or like, and Great Britain. But I think, you know, opening up to networks of trade and colonization, you know, so long as we were understanding bodies that are moving along those networks was one way to kind of bring it back to why this was still a Europe, you know, why this was an important project pertaining to European art itself. So I wish, you know, there was more friction that I could point to in the timeline. But I think in a way, keeping it to a minimum helped us, you know, avoid some of that. Louis, do you remember any instances where it was just like, because you worked so closely with just even that the transfer? I mean, do you remember any inconsistencies?
Yeah, especially with where the images come from. Some were taken right from the collection on a particular museum's website, but some of them came from third-party websites like Tumblr or Pinterest.
That's
so
a
it
great
was
point.
it was tricky. Yeah, so it was tricky to I guess keep that consistency. And it's something that I had to go back and search it and check other sources, and then check with Professor Zirwat to make sure that was an acceptable source, and also how we cite such source as well, because some sources have a particular way they want us to cite their collections. For instance, the Royal Collection has a very particular way to the Queen wants us to write the citations. So yeah,
we had a lot of fun
regard,
with that.
yeah. So in that regard, yeah, it was definitely somewhat of a challenge, but it was at the same time like really nice to see how many people were contributing to the timeline.
Our next question is from Whitney Mannies. Whitney asks if you would share any projects you've had or will have your students do using this resource.
I don't immediately, I mean, I'm teaching a graduate seminar right now, and certainly the resource is available to my students as they, you know, go through the topic of that seminar. I think, you know, I'm really excited to see what we can do with it when I reteach that undergraduate survey in the spring. And especially, you know, it's really exciting to be able to share with students in the future that one of their classmates, you know, from the past was a part of this project as well. I do know, for example, that, you know, colleagues at other institutions have certainly discussed it, you know, or shared this resource with their students. I'm trying to think. I know that a colleague of mine who is teaching an 18th century art class at NYU has her students doing, you know, museum label type exercises based on these entries. But really, I think, we just debuted it in, or like, it just went live in September. So there's, we haven't had a lot of time pass still, but I know that one thing I've noticed is a lot of colleagues at other institutions are also talking about this timeline as a way to talk about archival, erasures and continuities as well. So that's as much as I can say for now. Thank you for that.
We have a few more questions that have come in. Claudia Swan says, thank you very much for this inspiring resource. Claudia asks, how do you recommend users of the timeline correlate it with or consult it in association with the volumes of the Demental series of publications on the image of the Black? Thank you again on behalf of my students.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for also just making this nod to that multi-volume series. It's interesting, even just thinking about the two, back to kind of Salone's earlier question, the image of the Black versus Blackness, immobility and visibility. I think you can start to see how there is hopefully a productive resonance, but some important differentials between the two projects as well. I think one important thing, and I know that the A&E portal makes and maybe other portals too or online platforms too make the book available or accessible without a paywall at the moment. But, it's a hefty volume. It is not an easy volume just to these are not easy volumes to just flip through. They're extremely erudite and informative. But I think there's also a way in which it's, they don't lend themselves to a certain kind of cross-reference system, which I think that this digital timeline makes easier. So I would hope that they can be kind of pendants to one another and companionate pieces. One thing I would add is I think there's a way in which it's almost like there's a bifurcation in that image of the Black series, in its Menil lifetime and then in its Harvard lifetime, because as you know, the project kind of shifted hands at one point. And what started with the Menil Foundation as this kind of desire to find, ennobling representations of Blackness across European history, I think, of course, then for the 17th and 18th century volumes quickly fell into the challenge of how does one talk about that in relation to the history of slavery. And I think, one thing that's very much emerged within the scholarship on the history of slavery is, I won't say a dispute, but a productive dissonance between scholars who write the history of slavery from the perspective of abolition and those who are writing about it from the perspective of Black emancipation. And what I hope this timeline, again, we only provided so much didactic information, but even just in terms of its privileging of the scholarship of scholars, of BIPOC scholars, that it maybe makes a bit more room for that self-determination, emancipation narrative, and moves away a little bit from the abolition discourse, which has hitherto been at the forefront. But thank you, and I hope it's a useful resource for you and your students.
Our next question comes from Tony Kui, who says that they are curious about your thoughts on how the format of the timeline and its linearity affected the project itself. Having worked through the entries, how do you reflect on the motif of chronology itself as a methodological function? How did the various entries conform with or challenge the idea of the advent of modernity, which might be Eurocentric to begin with?
Oh my goodness, Tony, if I could answer that really important question in a few words, I would need to retire tomorrow. But thank you for it. And it really touches on so many aspects of the ambitions that, so many aspects of the ambitions that went into this, this project as well. I mean, you're absolutely right to ask about, sort of the linearity of chronology. And I think, this is, it's something that we certainly face so much in art history and are constantly having to work around, right? Like, do chronologies automatically replicate the logic of teleological progress? And I'm not entirely sure they do. And one of the reasons I actually felt quite comfortable embarking on this timeline, very chronological project is several years ago, I was at a museum in Bogota. I think it was like the Museum of Gold. And they actually had this really incredible chronology of the museum, but it kind of put into spatial relation events that were happening across different parts of the globe. So at the same time that there was this kind of linearity to the chronology, there was a kind of stratification to it as well. And I think that allowed for ways to bring out of that linear narrative that I hope also this cross-referential system that we invite our, our users of the timeline to embark upon will make possible as well. Now, in terms of, the advent of modernity, I think, again, one of the things I think that I talked about in the introduction, and I hope makes itself manifest in different ways and through different trajectories on this timeline, is that in a certain way, that particular formulation of modernity relies upon, I think we are experiencing in particularly abject ways in our present moment, of a certain understanding of freedom and liberty in terms of whiteness. And I think to think about modernity as also unfreedoms, but claims upon other formulations of freedom, maybe opens up ways to acknowledge something called a process of, called the processes of modernization and modernity, without necessarily making, without necessarily subscribing to its assumptions about a certain kind of triumph of white progress as well. So that's what I would answer. That's what I would offer at the moment.
And our final question comes from Chris Cohen. Chris says, as your answer about the term attendant shows, you seem as, if not more, interested in mobility as immobility, the ways paintings or representations might loosen or agitate immobilities. Can you talk about why immobility is the foregrounded term?
Hi, Chris, thank you. Immobility became a foregrounded and really operative term in this project from something that exists in the historical record again, because the French words mobilier and immobilier are used to describe the two forms of property, which are tied in turn to the various forms of white personhood across the long 18th century, so the 17th and 18th centuries, or the early modern era, I think one could say. And we were really, one thing that kind of struck me when I was starting to do this project was how, of course, as we're talking about what constituted as movable property and as immovable property, we weren't just talking about goods, right? Like land and goods, meaning, say, for example, country estates versus the paintings in them, but we were also, of course, talking about enslaved bodies. And so the fact that, there's really there's a kind of deliberation over where one posits a body that is both fungible and yet mobile, has its own properties of mobility, even though the restriction of that mobility is what creates it as property. I think all of those tensions are part of this history of immobility, but of course the history of how then you have these Black bodies made immobile in the corners of these paintings as well. And that's one of the reasons why really, I wanted to, in that introduction, frame this project without trying in any way to, be too prescriptive of it, to talk about this relationship between immobility and Blackness, also in terms of that, that remnant hand in the Hogarth as well. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
I feel like this has been an incredibly rich discussion and such a workout for both of you. And Zirwat, I'm really just blown away by how brilliant you are and how brilliant you both are, and what a rich and provocative discussion this was. I think that whole idea of the whiteness of freedom and liberty, that's really going to resonate with me. Something I want to think about a lot more. We are still experimenting with Zoom, and my feeling is that Zoom is tiring, and while it's wonderful, this might be a great place to stop. But I guess I would just ask you both, is there anything else that you would like to say before we sign off? And I also just want to thank you both so much for all the work you've done on this resource, which is going to keep growing and changing, it
I
sounds
hope
like,
so.
which is really exciting. And I also just wanted to thank the staff of the center
Yes.
for everything they've done to make this event happen. But would you like to say anything in closing before we sign off?
I would just like to echo your words of thanks very much, to Kathy and to Jeanette and to Alistair. And I'm sorry, it's one of those moments of have I named everybody, but I am so grateful for the support from the center and really for, giving us, we were trying to do this in this very expedited manner. And I think there were just moments in which you and the staff at the center just gave us, just reassurance, take your time. And I think that matters so much in being able to do projects like this, where you, especially in a moment of, sort of urgency as well. So thank you very much for that. And Luis, thank you so much. Truly, it was such a pleasure to be able to work with you on this project. And, a particular treat to have a student be in a class and then be in the journey that follows that class. And you were just such a trooper about doing this through the summer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was definitely very exciting to work on this, and especially because I feel like, especially now, it's a really important tool for anyone to use on research, and I feel like it's very much accessible now, whereas before there was nothing at least this accessible before. So yeah, it was definitely, albeit the technical difficulties, it was definitely a delight to work on.
Well, you two are an inspiration to all of us. Thank you again. Thank you everybody for coming and taking the time to be with us today. And we will hopefully see you at our next event. So bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you.